$28 trillion in debt. Whose fault is it? Republicans, Democrats? The answer is yes. Yes on both fronts. Both parties are responsible for the debt. Now, one side is honest about it. One side will tell you they don't give a fig about the debt. The debt be damned. We're for new monetary theory. Spend as much as you've got, borrow as much as you can, and somehow we're going to combat the influence of China by borrowing more money from China. Doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, but that's where we are. So we have before us a bill that will simply add to the debt. We will go further in debt. You might make the argument that we're actually less strong as a nation the more in debt we are. Where's the opposition? Now, there's no opposition on one side of the aisle, and on the other side, there's feigned opposition. Republicans will feign opposition to the debt, and they will say, well, yes, we care about the debt, and the other side spends too much and borrows too much. And you hear Republicans throughout the land campaigning against the debt, only to come to Washington and vote for most of the debt. So what we end up with is a $28 trillion debt. We actually borrow more in a month than we used to borrow in a year. In March of this year, we borrowed $660 billion in 1 month. The proposals for spending are alarming. We have spent and borrowed more in the last 2 years than we did during World War II. There are going to be repercussions of so much borrowing in such a short period of time. We are seeing a misallocation of capital throughout the economy. We are seeing a grossly inflated stock market. We are starting to see inflation throughout the supply chain, throughout the economy. There are going to be repercussions. The question we have to ask ourselves are we willing to look at the example of countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe that completely destroyed their currency? People say that couldn't happen in America. It largely hasn't happened because we've been the reserve currency of the world. We've been fortunate. People describe it as having the cleanest shirt in a closet full of dirty shirts. The dollar is weakened by such extravagant spending, and yet people still cling to the dollar because the other currencies are weaker. But this bill simply adds more to the debt. And we say we're going to combat China through this bill, but we're going to combat China by increasing a department of government, the National Science Foundation, that is actually probably one of the most wasteful agencies in government. William Proxmire was a conservative Democrat from Wisconsin back in the 60s and 70s. He started an award called the Golden Fleece Award. One of the first awards he gave
Order in the chamber, please.
One of the first awards that William Proxmire gave, the Golden Fleece Award, was an award for a study about what makes people fall in love. You'd think with the lampooning through the years, the ridiculous lizards on treadmills of Panamanian frogs, that after a while people would say, instead of giving this agency that is so full of waste and ridiculous studies, maybe instead of giving them more money, we should give them less money. So perhaps if we wanted them to reform, we would say to the National Science Foundation, instead of increasing your budget 68%, why don't we reduce their budget 10% and say behave better? Why don't we reform how they pick their committees? So for example, if you want to study—
You need order in the chamber.
If you want to study cocaine and you want to study Japanese quail using cocaine and you want to know if they're more sexually promiscuous, do you know how you get approval for your funding? You call up your other buddies that study cocaine in animals and you say, hey, I've got this great new study. Would you guys like to join in it and be my peer review committee? So it's actually the ridiculous studies that we discover, they're being voted on by people who are selected by the people doing the studies. So what they do is they select other people with ridiculous studies and they say, we'll vote for yours if you vote for mine. So how do we get, $500,000 spent studying Panamanian frogs? They want to know whether or not the mating call of the country frogs in Panama is different than the mating calls of the city frogs. Well, coming from a rural state, I can tell you the mating calls of the country folk is always different than the city folk. We could have polled the audience. Are quail more sexually promiscuous on cocaine? I think we could have polled the audience. So the thing is, there could be some reforms. So for example, as much as I'm opposed to government spending, there are some important diseases, let's say Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, heart disease. Why wouldn't we make the committees for the National Science Foundation, why wouldn't we make the committees have someone on there from one of the big 5 diseases? Why wouldn't we put a taxpayer advocate on there? Why wouldn't we have some sort of inspector general process so this doesn't happen? You know, we have to review this. This is an academic point. We've now discovered that the NIH was funding the Wuhan lab. So we should have oversight on what happens. But after 50 years of abuse at the National Science Foundation, we're still studying, will people eat ants to combat climate change? Seriously, that was a study. How many ants will people eat? And how many ants do you have to eat to reduce the global warming by 1 degree? It's a lot of ants. But the thing is that's the kind of studies that we're having coming out of here, and we don't make it any better by increasing their budget. If you are a wasteful agency and we give you more money, we'll get more waste. If you want less waste, and this goes not only for this, it goes for the military, it goes for any other agency of government. If you give any agency more government money, you'll get more waste. You won't get less. So the cocaine was actually NIH, not NSF. NIH has got some of the same problems. One of the ones from the NIH in recent years was $2 million to see if someone in the buffet line, when you're going through the buffet or Luby's cafeteria, and someone in front of you sneezes on the food, are you more or less likely to eat the food? $2 million. Now look, if you want to come to me and say we should study Alzheimer's disease, I've got open ears. Heart disease, diabetes. But if you want to study whether somebody sneezing on the food makes you more or less likely to eat the food, that's just ridiculous. The American people know it's ridiculous. If the American people could see what we're voting on and saying, oh, we're going to combat China by giving more money to the most wasteful agency in the world. And where's the money coming from? Is it out of a surplus? Can we go over to the Federal Reserve and open this big safe? There's a big cache of money. Is there a rainy day fund? Is there a savings account that we can tap into to say we're going to have government-funded research to combat China? Well, no, we have to borrow the money from China. Think of the irony. We borrow the money from China to put it into technology. We complain about Chinese socialism, which is the government running everything and spending all the money. And so what are we going to do? The same thing. We're going to borrow the money from China, and then we're going to have government-directed research that we all say, oh, socialism is the government directing this. Then we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to be stronger than China. A good example of how, and this is sort of a technical detail of how the committee process works and how grant funding works. There was $700,000 allotted from the National Science Foundation for autism. Look, I know parents who have kids with autism. I can be convinced that the federal government can be involved in some way. But the $700,000 that was allotted for autism was then taken and subcontracted to a bunch of eggheads who wanted to listen to a tape of Neil Armstrong on the moon. So if you're as old as me, you can remember being in school and seeing the crackly black and white pictures coming back from the moon and hearing Neil Armstrong say, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Or did he say, one small step for a man? So a group of researchers, and I use the term loosely, at the National Science Foundation got $700,000 of autism money to study one word, the preposition a. Did Neil Armstrong use the letter A or the word A, or did he not? So they studied, and they were diligent. They listened to this 20-second clip over and over and over again. I think it took them a year of listening to this. They wrote reports and had findings. And you know what their conclusion was in the end? We just don't know. We just don't know. Was it one small step for man or one small step for a man? So this is something you could fix. Before throwing and heaping more borrowed money on the National Science Foundation, maybe we could say you can't subcontract money that was meant for Alzheimer's to ridiculous research. How would you stop it? Maybe you would have a committee that reviews the grants that has someone on the committee from one of the big 5 diseases that actually says, should we be spending the money on autism or should we spend the money on Neil Armstrong's statement on the moon? Should we be spending it on this versus diabetes? See, everything's a trade-off. Everybody comes to Washington, and if you ask them, you know, the people who advocate for Alzheimer's or diabetes or cancer, are you getting enough money? And when I tell them, the autism parents, that their money went to study Neil Armstrong, you know what I get? Dropped jaws and people going, you've got to be kidding me. My mother or father is dwindling away from Alzheimer's, and they spent money studying Neil Armstrong? Did he say one step, giant step for man, or one small step? This is lizards on the treadmill. Dr. Coburn was a senator here for a long time, and he liked to talk about waste as I do. And so this is a decade ago, maybe more, that Senator Coburn was on the floor and he would talk about lizards on a treadmill. I think his was lizards underwater on a treadmill, or no, it was shrimp on a treadmill, I think. But they've got lizards on treadmill, they've got shrimp, they've got crawfish on treadmill. But think about it, really. We are a big, proud country, but we are $1 trillion in debt before we get to all the extra stuff. Before we get to all the COVID bailouts, we're $1 trillion in debt just from the institutional expenses of the country. So we bring in about $3 trillion in revenue, and we spend about $4 trillion. Of the money that we bring in, $3 trillion's a lot. We could spend that on a lot of good things, but we can't simply just say, we're going to spend it on, lizards on a treadmill, that somehow we have enough money to do that. So of the expenses that we have, most of the money is consumed by Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, and the military, and then a variety of welfare programs. But that consumes $1 trillion more than comes in. So we've been meeting over the last year and just spending extra money beyond the $1 trillion deficit. So we have $1 trillion deficit just from our ordinary expenses, and then we add to that, a couple trillion here for COVID last year, a couple trillion more. We're going to do a couple trillion more for free college, free daycare, free this, free that. But it's not free. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There is nothing in this world that you will get for free. You will either have the future paying for it.
Order in the chamber.
You will either have the future paying for it, our kids and our grandkids paying for it, or you will pay for it through inflation, or you pay for it through default. And you can default in a dramatic way through the destruction of a currency, or you can default in a gradual way through price inflation. As it is, we're starting to see the price inflation take off. There are people concerned about inflation that's already hit the stock market and where this goes from here. But I don't think this bill makes us stronger. In fact, I think the Chinese sit back and, hold their hand up and sort of titter and laugh at America, thinking they're going to be stronger by borrowing more money from China. So I just don't think it makes us any stronger at all. I think it makes us weaker. And it would be one thing if it weren't being so horribly wasted. Lizards on a treadmill. So they get the lizard on a treadmill, and then they have active x-rays to look at its joints. They were curious as to why a lizard waddles. So have you ever seen a lizard or an iguana? They walk funny, they waddle. So why do they waddle? What do their joints look like in x-rays? And so we spent, $1.5 million studying lizards on a treadmill. One of the perennial problems in the third world is the black market. We have it in our country, and it's sort of a function of when taxes and regulation in the official economy become so onerous that you need to escape the official economy. That's what the black market is. So a good example is New York City. The taxes on cigarettes are so high in New York City that you have a black market. In fact, the death of Eric Garner, the sad death of Eric Garner being choked to death in New York City, had to do with taxes. And some people were offended by this, like, oh, it was police brutality. Of course it was. But it was police brutality based on exorbitant taxes that caused this man to be selling cigarettes, loose cigarettes, in order to try to make a living. But that's what happens when government becomes so big. So in parts of Africa, Uganda in particular, there's a big black market. And so, God knows why, or why in the world we're spending our money studying this, we decided to study gambling in Uganda. So we spent $30,000 studying gambling in Uganda. Well, it turns out the black market develops because they don't have good title to their land, they don't have good rule of law, they don't have the things that have made our country great. But instead of sort of exporting think tank ideas on how great capitalism is, we waste it through government grants studying why Ugandans gamble. It kind of is reminiscent going back to the Wuhan lab. People say, and this is what Dr. Fauci's been saying, Dr. Fauci says, well, who wouldn't want to study the SARS virus? Well, yeah, we should. But then again, why would we pay the Chinese to do it? Well, there's all these viruses in China. Well, are the Chinese destitute? I think we're here because the Chinese are kicking our butt in trade, and everybody's worried about China, so we're going to do all this stuff to combat China, and yet we send money to a Chinese lab. Now, we've recently voted to change that, but it's been going on for decades. In fact, Dr. Fauci in committee the other day said he still trusts the Chinese scientists. Seems oblivious to the fact that perhaps there's a military influence in these labs, and perhaps the scientists don't do anything without permission of the Chinese military. Perhaps that there was a militarization of the virus going on, oblivious to that. So there's a space camp in Alabama. My kids went to it one year. It's a great camp, and I'm all for it. I, would like to see more Americans go. If some American kids, don't have the means, it'd be nice if we could help American kids go to space camp. But I'm not so sure, why we would borrow money from China to send kids in Pakistan to space camp in Alabama or to Dollywood. $250,000. We also spent over $1 million in Afghanistan doing an anti-drug program. Unfortunately, really, the drugs problems in our country, they grow it like corn. It's a crop for them. The problem is the demand comes from us. We spent $1 million on a public relations television programming in Afghanistan, and it was to convince the Afghanis not to use drugs. It was in English. So the vast majority of them couldn't understand, or, most of them don't have television sets anyway. But this is the kind of thing that runs rampant throughout our government. So, we talk about where would we find the resources to be a strong country again, to do the things that we could do to combat what happens in China. When we look at that and we say, where could the money come from? Well, we spend $50 billion a year in Afghanistan on the war. It's been going on 20 years. The war's 18 years past having any useful mission at all. The mission was over probably once the Taliban was defeated. There was still some mission for bin Laden, but didn't really require necessarily troops on the ground and nation building. But we've been doing nation building in Afghanistan. So our nation crumbles. We worry about China, the threat of the ascendance of China, and yet, what are we doing? We're borrowing money from China to build roads in Afghanistan. One of the things they did in Afghanistan years ago is they were going to build a natural gas station. This was to reduce the footprint of Afghanistan, the carbon footprint. So this is the absurdities we sometimes go to with climate change. This is a country that cooks their food on open fires often. This is a country with an average income of about $800. Most people do not have a car. So what did we decide to do for Afghanistan to reduce their carbon footprint? We decided to build a natural gas station. So the natural gas station was built. It was supposed to cost $800,000, but sometimes government's not that efficient, so they had a few cost overruns, 83, and it ended up costing $45 million. So my question, as I heard about this natural gas station, was how many Americans have a car that runs on natural gas? I think there's a handful of people who are really into it and have converted their cars into running on natural gas. There's a trucking company I'm aware of. And it's not a bad idea, but it's a boneheaded, idiotic idea to build a gas station for natural gas vehicles in Afghanistan. They don't have cars, much less cars that run on natural gas. But we did it. We spent $45 million in Afghanistan on it. So my staff was over there looking at the waste. and they said to the military, can we go see the famous natural gas station? And as they wanted to go see it, the Marines said, well, it would take two helicopters full of 30 Marines in each helicopter to take you to the gas station. So we were told it was too dangerous, and we didn't want to insist on something that was that dangerous. So we spent $45 million on a gas station that we can't visit because it's too dangerous to serve up natural gas that nobody has a car that runs on natural gas. And my imagination goes to the gas station. All I can imagine is sort of copper tubing sticking out of the ground, people running off with copper tubing. We built major highways over there, but one of the biggest problems is no cars. But the other problem they have in Afghanistan is people put their camels in their tents. And so if you ever want a car to go up and down the road, you got to shoo the camels and the tents off the road. We decided to build luxury hotels. See, this is part of our national defense. I think it was the Overseas Investment Bank or whatever. We spent $90 million on a hotel in Kabul. Well, we didn't quite get finished. The contractor built about half the hotel. He built the shell of the hotel with no walls. I think he completed one room so he could send pictures home to say he was making progress. The hotel was never built. The guy ran off with like 60 million of the 90 million. The hotel still sits there. And guess what? It's a shell of a building. Our people are worried about the Taliban crawling up in it and shooting down into our embassy. So the next thing is, I'm surprised it's not in this bill, maybe, who knows what's in this bill. They need another 250 grand to destroy what's left of the hotel. The guy ran off with the money, and we have the shell of a building. It's a danger to our embassy, so we need to tear it down. So really, we should have an amendment to put more money in this bill to tear down the hotel, the luxury hotel that we subsidized in Afghanistan. The list goes on and on and on. The frustration of the American people is, why does it never change? William Proxmire was talking about this in 1972, studying why people fall in love. Why do people date? Governments doing dating apps, studying why people are happy or unhappy, studying whether or not if you take a selfie of yourself smiling and look at it later in the day, whether or not that'll make you happy. Seriously, 500,000 here, 1 million there. Is there anything in this bill that will stop that from happening? So it's been happening for 50 years. We didn't even authorize these things. They just go on and on. There's no oversight. You ask any questions, nobody wants to give you any answers, and it goes on and on. Now, this isn't just one party. Both parties do it, and both parties are going to vote for this bill. But I guarantee if you put up the different waste things that are going on in our government, and you said that this is the agency that's studying the mating call of the Panamanian frog, these are the agencies studying whether someone sneezes on your food, do you think the American people would be with you? They're only with you because they don't know what you're doing today. They don't know that you're wasting more money, that you're shoveling good money after bad. They don't know that this is more of the same, that this has been going on for 50 years, and nobody, Republican or Democrat, is fixing the problem. We're just shoveling more money out the door. We're destroying our country. We're destroying our currency. Right now, it's a little bit at a time. It's coming through inflation, but inflation's out there. It's lurking. People are talking about it. But there's also another way you can destroy your country. If you look at the 20th century and you look at the decline in the stock market, most of it's in like 7 days. So those who think that we couldn't have a precipitous correction, that there couldn't be a precipitous correction where all of a sudden everybody wakes up in the marketplace and says, oh my goodness, the emperor has no clothes. We're $28 trillion in debt, and we have companies that have, 200 to 1 price to earnings ratio. We have companies that are worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars. And yet, what is their profit? Some of them don't make profit. Is there going to be a day where people wake up and say, oh my goodness, the stock market, the emperor has no clothes, and there's a massive sell-off? I don't know. But I do worry that the stock market is grossly inflated. I do worry when we pass out $1,400 checks, which we did not have. We give them to everybody, and what do the young people do with their checks? Buying GameStop. So GameStop goes through the roof, makes no profit. It's a dying company, and it goes through the roof because everybody gets giddy on it because everybody's got all this free money. There is no free money. Ultimately, the $1,400 we gave to people will be lost as wages don't keep up with inflation. It happens even as we speak. Inflation has been low, but over the last decade, the dollar lost 17% of its purchasing power. Do you think everybody in America got a 17% gain? See, this is sort of the difference between the seen and the unseen. Frédéric Bastiat was a philosopher, parliamentarian in France in the 19th century, and he talked a lot about this. He wrote a book called The Law, and he talked about the seen and the unseen. It's also the intended and the unintended. People, I call it the big heart, small brain syndrome of Washington. Everybody wants to help somebody. We have the same compassion. We want to help those out of work. But if you give people too much not to work, then they won't work. If people don't work for a long period of time, they won't be hired again. This was illustrated when we extended unemployment to 99 weeks. It was done out of compassion, but as we extended unemployment to 99 weeks, what happened? Anybody who stayed out of work 99 weeks and came in looking for a job, if there was another worker that had been out of work less, guess who got hired? Every study showed this. So if an employer is faced with two employees, one's been out of work 10 weeks and one's been out of work 99 weeks, guess who gets hired? The one's been out of work 10 weeks. And so when you institutionalize unemployment, when you pay people more from the government not to work than to work, you get a permanent class of unemployed. And there comes a point at which they are not employable. Now, what does that do to a people? What does that do to a person? See, I think our self-esteem is tied up in what we do for a living. And I think there's self-esteem in every job, from cleaning the floors to designing the carpet to creating the carpet to laying bricks to being a doctor or a lawyer. Your self-esteem comes from being proud of your work, but it comes from work. You cannot get self-esteem without work, and you can't be given self-esteem. We have some newfangled ideas in school that we just give it. You know, Johnny can't spell, but we're going to pat him on the back and give him a trophy because it'll help his self-esteem. No, you have to earn self-esteem. But if we get a whole class of people who doesn't work, it's a problem. The lack of self-esteem, the worry and the concern that comes from this, the lack of what it takes to be a robust person is part of the problem with the sinking into despair and addiction that we have as a problem in our country. This is another waste project. This comes out of our State Department. So, you know, we fund the State Department for diplomacy. I'm for that. But we end up funding things in the State Department. You wonder if they're useful for diplomacy or whether they're just pork barrel politics. This was $850,000 that was given to a for-profit Afghan television station to support the development of a national cricket league. Really? So our State Department, which, you know, we have to pay ambassadors, we got to pay assistant ambassadors, we got to pay, you know, all the different personnel, those protecting the ambassador in our embassies. We got to pay for the embassies, the electricity, all that stuff we have to do. I'm for that. Where do we get the money to pay for cricket? Where is it the business of the U.S. government? But here's the point. Does it ever get better? Did someone go, my goodness, someone stuck this little earmark in for the National Cricket League? Does someone ever say, oh my goodness, we did this, and we reform the process and say never again? No, we give them more money. Every year, every agency in government gets more money. If you think there is a waste problem in government and you want to fix it, it won't get better if you give people more money. You would have to give them less. So what I'd do is I'd give everybody 99% of what they had last year. If it's a terrible agency like the National Science Foundation, I might give them 50% of what they had last year. And I would say to them, prove to me that you're not going to do this again. So they were studying dating back in '72 and Proxmire lampooned them. 50 years later, they're studying selfies. They haven't learned their lesson. If you look at the process, they pick the people they want to approve their projects. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You do cocaine studies, hey, me too. Well, you approve my cocaine study, I'll approve yours. That's what goes on with the National Science Foundation. close to home, and you may have seen it. We call it a streetcar named Waste. It's about a couple blocks from the Capitol over on H Street, and it's a streetcar they spent millions of dollars on, and for years there was nobody on it, and for years it didn't go anywhere. It was a streetcar to nowhere, basically. But we spent $1.6 million on this, and basically you could see it as basically a trolley car with nobody in it. It was sort of this nostalgia. It's one thing to preserve something, but it's another to create some sort of thing that hasn't existed for 50 years and nobody rides. But that cost us $1.6 million, and often you'll see it sitting vacant or not in use at all. Now, we've decided that, I don't know why they even think they need this anymore, because I think climate alarmism has really penetrated all of our education. But just in case there's a child in the country that's not afraid that the oceans will rise and cover the land and that we're all going to drown and that the polar bears are going to drown, we need to make sure they know it through a special video game. So we spent $500,000 on a video app to try to convince our kids that the polar bears are drowning sometime soon and that the end of the world is around the corner. Will the chair inform me how much time I have remaining?
28.5 minutes.
All right. I think at this point I would reserve the remainder of my time. You ready?